Death, in America's Gilded Age, could be the most liberating event in a woman's life. In an era when a woman could not vote, could rarely control her own inheritance, and was expected to ornament rather than operate the machinery of power, the death of a spouse represented something unprecedented, legal and financial freedom wrapped in the respectability of mourning black. The law recognized what society preferred to ignore, that some women possessed minds capable of expanding fortunes rather than merely spending them, of building empires rather than simply inhabiting them, when the keys to vast enterprises would pass into hands that had been deemed too delicate to hold them. These women would discover that in a nation built on the promise of reinvention, even the ancient role of widow could be revolutionized by those bold enough to see mourning not as an ending but as a beginning. When you inherit billions from one of America's wealthiest families, you'd expect that money to provide security, freedom, and happiness for the rest of your life. Madeleine Astor discovered that some fortunes come with conditions so restrictive they transform wealth into a prison, forcing impossible choices between love and money that would ultimately destroy everything she held dear. Her story represents the dark side of inherited wealth, where legal clauses designed to protect family assets become weapons that punish the very people they're meant to benefit. From surviving history's most famous maritime disaster to becoming America's youngest billionaire widow, Madeleine's journey seemed destined for a fairy tale ending. Instead, she would learn that the Astor family fortune carried a price tag that demanded she sacrifice her personal happiness to maintain her financial security. Her tragic descent from unimaginable privilege to devastating poverty proves that sometimes the most expensive inheritance is the one that costs you everything else worth having. Therefore, in today's episode of Old Money Allure, we examine how Madeleine Astor's billion-dollar inheritance became her ultimate downfall. Some love stories begin with scandal, but few achieve the spectacular level of public outrage that greeted 18-year-old Madeleine Force's engagement to 47-year-old Colonel John Jacob Astor IV in 1911. Born on June 19, 1893, in Brooklyn, Madeleine Talmadge Force grew up in a well-to-do but not aristocratic family that owned a successful shipping company and moved in respectable New York social circles. Her father, William Hurlbut Force, was prosperous enough to send Madeleine and her sister Catherine to prestigious schools like Miss Spence's in Manhattan, where Madeleine was noted as a brilliant pupil who travelled frequently to Europe. The Force family spent summers in Bar Harbor, Maine, where wealthy Americans gathered to escape the heat. And it was here in 1910 that 17-year-old Madeleine met her destiny in the form of one of America's richest men. Colonel John Jacob Astor IV was worth an estimated $87 to $150 million, roughly 2.4 to 4.1 billion in today's currency, making him not just wealthy but genuinely one of the world's richest individuals. But Astor came with serious baggage that made him a deeply problematic romantic prospect. He had just endured a scandalous divorce from Ava Lowell Willing in 1909 after 18 years of marriage. Divorce was still considered social suicide in 1910, especially for a man of Astor's prominence, and his ex-wife had received a settlement of about $10 million, making their split one of the most expensive in American history. The 29-year age gap between Madeleine and Astor provided endless ammunition for newspaper cartoonists who lampooned them as Papa and the Baby, while high society reacted with the kind of moral horror usually reserved for actual crimes. When their engagement was announced in August 1911, the public reaction was so venomous that Madeleine reportedly collapsed from the stress of constant media scrutiny and had to retreat from public appearances. Finding a minister willing to perform the ceremony became a genuine challenge, as several Episcopal priests refused to officiate due to Astor's divorced status and the scandalous nature of the match. Eventually, a Congregationalist minister named Reverend Joseph Lambert agreed to perform the ceremony, reportedly for a fee of $2,000, approximately $56,000 in today's money, though he resigned from his church shortly after due to public backlash. The wedding took place on September 9, 1911, at Beechwood, Astor's Newport mansion, with Vincent Astor serving as his father's best man despite the family tensions surrounding the marriage. Even Astor's own mother stayed away from the ceremony, and New York society largely shunned the couple, forcing them to flee to Europe immediately after the wedding to escape the relentless gossip and criticism. The Cincinnati Enquirer called their union a marriage of questionable morality, while rumours circulated that Madeline's family had been paid off to consent to the match, adding financial scandal to the moral outrage. But Madeline had achieved something extraordinary. She had married one of the world's richest men and gained access to a fortune that would make her one of the most powerful women in America, if she could survive the social consequences. What she couldn't know was that her triumph would be short-lived, and that history's most famous maritime disaster was already steaming toward an iceberg in the North Atlantic, carrying her husband to his death and her to a widowhood that would define the rest of her life. To escape the scandal surrounding their marriage, the newlyweds embarked on an extended honeymoon that would take them from luxury to tragedy in less than a year. The couple first sailed to Europe on the RMS Olympic, the Titanic's sister ship, before travelling to Egypt and Paris, where they lived as international celebrities while American society gossiped about their marriage. By early 1912, Madeline was 5 months pregnant, and the couple decided to return to New York for the birth, booking first-class passage on the maiden voyage of the most luxurious ship ever built. They boarded the RMS Titanic in Cherbourg, France, on April 10, 1912, with their full entourage: Astor's valet, Victor Robbins, Madeline's maid, Rosalie Bidois, her private nurse, Caroline Andres, and their beloved Airedale terrier named Kitty. Their parlour suite was one of the most luxurious accommodations on the ship, costing $4,350, approximately $50,000 in today's currency, for a journey that was supposed to mark their triumphant return to America. On the night of April 14, 1912, the Titanic struck an iceberg, and Astor initially reassured his pregnant wife that the damage was minor, trying to keep her calm as the situation deteriorated. As the reality of the disaster became clear, Madeline demonstrated remarkable compassion by lending her fur shawl to third-class passenger Leah Axe to keep her young son warm, a gesture that newspapers would later hail as proof of her true nobility. The couple retreated to the first-class gymnasium, where they sat on mechanical horses while wearing life jackets, with Astor even cutting open a spare life jacket with his penknife to show Madeline its contents and calm her fears. When it came time to evacuate, Madeline, her maid and nurse were assisted through a first-class promenade window to board Lifeboat 4, which had been lowered to the A deck to take on more passengers. Astor asked Second Officer Charles Lightoller for permission to join his pregnant wife in the lifeboat, citing her delicate condition, but was denied due to the Women and Children First protocol that was being strictly enforced. With remarkable composure for a man facing death, Astor calmly promised to meet Madeline later, saying, "The sea is calm, and you will be all right," giving her what would be their final kiss. Madeline's lifeboat was lowered at 1:55 a.m. with room for at least 15 more people, a haunting detail that would trouble survivors for the rest of their lives. John Jacob Astor IV died when the Titanic sank on April 15, 1912, and his body was recovered on April 22 by the cable ship Mackay Bennett, identified by his initials and a gold watch. When his body was found, he was carrying $2,440 in cash and diamond cufflinks, creating endless speculation about hidden jewels and the fortune that had gone down with the ship. Madeline was rescued by the RMS Carpathia and arrived in New York on April 18th, devastated and wearing only the clothes from that terrible night, transformed overnight from scandalous young bride to tragic teenage widow. At just 18 years old, she had become what newspapers called the richest girl who couldn't vote, inheriting a massive fortune that came with conditions that would ultimately destroy her future happiness. But Madeline's real tragedy wasn't losing her husband in the world's most famous maritime disaster. It was about to discover that the Astor family had built legal traps into his will that would force her to choose between love and money for the rest of her life. When John Jacob Astor IV's will was read, Madeleine discovered she had inherited a fortune that came with conditions so restrictive they would turn her wealth into a prison for the rest of her life. From Astor's $85 million estate, approximately $2.8 billion in today's currency, Madeleine received what appeared to be an incredibly generous inheritance that made her one of the wealthiest women in America. She inherited $100,000 outright, the annual income from a $5 million trust fund, an additional $500,000 annually, and the use of the magnificent Astor Fifth Avenue mansion at 65th Street. The inheritance also included the Newport mansion Beechwood with all its furnishings, a luxury limousine of her choice, 5 prized horses, and essentially everything needed to maintain the lifestyle of America's richest widow. But buried in the legal language was a clause that would prove to be the most expensive condition in inheritance history. If Madeleine remarried, she would forfeit the trust fund income and lose the use of all Astor properties. This wasn't just about money, it was about control, as the Astor family lawyers had designed the will to keep Astor assets within the bloodline and deter fortune hunters from pursuing the teenage widow. For 4 years, Madeleine lived as the world's wealthiest teenager who couldn't vote, controlling more liquid income than many robber barons' widows, but unable to sign large contracts without a male trustee's approval. She gave birth to the Titanic baby, John Jacob Astor VI, on August 14, 1912, raising him quietly at Beechwood while hosting small charitable events and living under constant media scrutiny. But in 1916, Madeleine made the decision that would destroy her financial security forever. She chose love over money by marrying her childhood friend, William Carl Dick, a banker and sugar refinery heir. William Carl Dick was wealthy but not Astor rich, and while he could provide a comfortable life, he couldn't replace the massive income stream that Madeleine was about to sacrifice for their marriage. The moment Madeleine said "I do" to Dick in Bar Harbor, Maine, she instantly relinquished the $5 million trust fund income and lost the use of both Astor mansions, which reverted to her stepson Vincent under the will's terms. This meant that her decision to remarry cost her the equivalent of approximately $160 million in today's currency, plus the use of properties worth tens of millions more, making it one of the most expensive wedding vows in history. While she retained the $100,000 cash legacy and some personal assets like horses and motor cars, the loss of the trust fund income meant she could no longer maintain anything approaching her previous lifestyle. Madeleine and Dick moved to a more modest Long Island estate and had 2 sons, William Force Dick and John Henry Dick II. But the marriage lasted only 17 years before ending in divorce in Reno, Nevada in 1933. Just months after her divorce from Dick, Madeleine shocked society again by marrying Enzo Fiamonte, an Italian prizefighter and actor who was 26 years old and had a wife and child in Italy. This marriage was considered so scandalous that Madeleine was dropped from the social register, the directory of America's elite, completing her fall from the heights of New York society to social exile. But Madeleine's financial troubles were just beginning, as her new husband would prove to be not just socially unacceptable, but personally dangerous in ways that would threaten both her remaining money and her physical safety. Madeleine's marriage to Enzo Fiamonte in 1933 marked the beginning of the most devastating chapter of her life, as her Italian boxer husband turned out to be both financially parasitic and physically violent. Fiamonte had expected continuous cash infusions from his wealthy American wife, but when Madeleine couldn't provide the lavish funding he demanded, he responded with the kind of brutality that would have shocked even hardened boxing fans. According to court testimony during their 1938 divorce proceedings, Fiamonte broke Madeleine's wrist and ribs during violent quarrels, transforming the woman who had once been America's most sympathetic widow into a battered wife living in fear. The physical abuse was accompanied by financial devastation, as Fiamonte burned through Madeleine's remaining assets with spectacular efficiency, spending her money on cars, racehorses and jewellery while contributing nothing to their household. When Madeline finally divorced Fiamonte in 1938 for extreme cruelty, the legal fees, hush money to prevent him from selling tell-all stories to tabloids, and his extravagant spending had rapidly depleted what remained of her non-Astor fortune. After their divorce, Fiamonte demonstrated his complete lack of class by selling a serialized tell-all story titled "I Married the Titanic Widow" to True Story magazine, earning more money from exploiting their marriage than Madeline received in yearly alimony. By this point, Madeline had lost not just her Astor inheritance, but also most of her personal wealth, forcing her to retreat to her last remaining asset, a small house in Palm Beach, Florida, that she had purchased in her own name. The woman who had once controlled an income equivalent to tens of millions of dollars annually was now living modestly in Florida, far removed from the Fifth Avenue mansion where she had once entertained New York's elite. Madeline spent her final years as a lonely figure in Palm Beach society, occasionally hosting illegal backroom baccarat games during ladies' afternoons to help pay expenses, a far cry from her days as America's wealthiest widow. Her health had been compromised by years of stress, trauma from the Titanic disaster, and the physical abuse she had suffered during her marriage to Fiamonte, leading to increasing reliance on prescription medications. On March 27, 1940, a maid found Madeline unresponsive in her Palm Beach home amid half-empty sedative bottles, leading to speculation about whether her death was accidental or intentional. While Manhattan newspapers reported sudden heart seizure as the official cause of death, gossip columns suggested a possible overdose, reflecting the tragic end of a life that had been marked by both extraordinary privilege and devastating loss. Estate filings revealed that Madeline died with less than $90,000 in liquid assets, a pittance compared to the fortune she had once controlled as the teenage widow of John Jacob Astor IV. The Fifth Avenue mansion where she had once lived in splendor now belonged to her stepson Vincent Astor, who ordered its demolition the same year she died to build a luxury apartment building, erasing even the physical reminder of her former life. Meanwhile, her son John Jacob Astor VI, the Titanic baby, spent 2 decades suing Vincent for a larger share of the family fortune, ultimately settling for just $250,000, barely 1% of the Astor wealth. Madeline's story serves as the ultimate cautionary tale about the hidden costs of inheriting wealth with conditions, proving that sometimes the price of choosing love over money is everything you once had and everything you might have been. The woman who had survived the Titanic disaster, endured public scandal, and rebuilt her life multiple times, ultimately could not survive the financial and emotional devastation of her own choices, dying alone and nearly penniless at just 46 years old. Most wealthy women of the Gilded Age collected art, jewellery, or charitable causes. Theresa Fair Ulrichs collected something far more complex and ultimately more destructive: absolute control over every detail of her manufactured paradise. Her obsessions began reasonably enough with mansion blueprints and party planning, but evolved into a consuming need to micromanage reality itself until every surface, every guest, every moment bent to her increasingly impossible standards. She approached social supremacy like an engineer, mapping out human relationships with the same precision her father had used to extract precious metals from stubborn Nevada rock. The results were spectacular: parties that became American legends, a palace that redefined luxury, and a reputation that made grown millionaires tremble over seating arrangements. But the same relentless drive that built her empire also guaranteed its destruction, as perfectionism transformed from asset into addiction, control from strategy into compulsion. Thus, in today's episode of Old Money Allure, we witness the ultimate cautionary tale about American ambition, where getting everything you want proves far more destructive than never getting it at all. Theresa Alice Fair emerged from the gritty boomtown of Virginia City, Nevada, on June 30th, 1871, born into a world where fortunes were ripped from the earth and squandered just as quickly. Her father, James Graham Fair, known to friends and enemies alike as Slippery Jim, had arrived from County Tyrone, Ireland, at age 12, with nothing but hunger in his belly and schemes in his head. By 1873, Fair and three fellow Irishmen struck what became known as the Big Bonanza, the largest single deposit of gold and silver ever discovered in American history, worth over $100 million, roughly $3.8 billion in today's currency. The Comstock lode transformed Fair from a penniless prospector into one of the legendary Bonanza Kings, but wealth corroded his character faster than Nevada alkali ate through mining equipment. Contemporary accounts painted him as mean-spirited and vindictive, a man who caught miners taking smoke breaks, joined them to puff his pipe underground in violation of safety rules, then fired them at shift's end for breaking the very regulations he'd flouted. His wife, Teresa Rooney Fair, a former boarding house operator who'd married him during his lean years, endured his drinking and serial adultery until 1883, when she filed for divorce, citing habitual adultery. The divorce became a national scandal, with Mrs. Fair securing a $5 million settlement, the largest in American history, plus custody of daughters Tessie and Virginia Birdie. While James kept their sons, young Tessie watched her family explode in the most public way possible, learning early that money could buy everything except discretion. After the divorce, mother and daughters abandoned Nevada's dusty mining camps for San Francisco's marble mansions and Newport's exclusive summer colony, where Tessie observed the rigid hierarchies governing America's emerging aristocracy. She spent her teenage years studying the elaborate protocols of social warfare that characterized high society, preparing for her own campaign of conquest. In 1889, while playing tennis at Newport's prestigious casino, 18-year-old Tessie met Herman Ulrichs, a prize catch at nearly 40, Yale-educated, from an established Baltimore family and American agent for the Norddeutsche Lloyd steamship line. Their courtship represented a calculated merger of new money seeking old prestige, with Ulrichs offering the social connections Tessie's millions couldn't buy outright. The wedding on June 3, 1890 in San Francisco was a spectacular affair, marred by one telling absence. James Fair wasn't invited, as Tessie feared he'd appear drunk and embarrass everyone. Nevertheless, Slippery Jim demonstrated either generosity or guilt by presenting the couple with $1 million, approximately $35 million today, as a wedding gift. The newlyweds established themselves in a mansion at 1 East 57th Street, at the corner of Fifth Avenue, which they purchased and improved with $150,000 in renovations. But Tessie's real ambitions lay in Newport, where America's wealthiest families competed in architectural one-upmanship and social warfare conducted with invitation lists and seating charts. In 1891, she and Birdie purchased 11 acres of oceanfront property from historian George Bancroft, who'd cultivated magnificent rose gardens that gave the estate its name, Rosecliff. Tessie had learned from her father that half measures were for losers. She would build a palace that would force Newport society to acknowledge her supremacy. The mining camp girl was about to show the Eastern establishment what Western money could accomplish when combined with ruthless ambition and an absolute refusal to be ignored, starting with a commission for Stanford White that would end in murder. Tessie Fair Ulrichs didn't believe in waiting for anything, least of all social acceptance. So when she commissioned Stanford White to design her Newport cottage, she demanded nothing less than an American Versailles. White, simultaneously creating palaces for other industrial titans, drew inspiration from the Grand Trianon, the garden retreat where French royalty had escaped the suffocating protocols of court life, though Tessie intended her mansion for exactly the opposite purpose. The H-shaped mansion that rose from 1899 to 1902 cost $2.5 million, $91 million in today's currency, and sprawled across 28,800 square feet of calculated magnificence. At its heart lay Newport's largest private ballroom, a breathtaking space measuring 40 by 80 feet, with ceilings soaring toward elaborate murals that depicted scenes of aristocratic leisure Tessie had never experienced in Nevada's mining camps. So impatient was she to establish dominance that she began hosting parties in the unfinished ballroom, forcing Newport's elite to navigate construction debris to attend her soirees. The mansion's 30 rooms included a reception salon modelled after Versailles' Salon Doré, complete with carved musical instruments representing the arts. Tessie was determined to patronise into submission. Every detail screamed wealth and sophistication: hand-carved mouldings, Caen stone facades, a heart-shaped staircase engineered specifically for dramatic entrances, and windows offering panoramic ocean views. But Tessie's true genius lay not in architecture, but in social engineering, demonstrated when she manoeuvred her way into the triumvirate that succeeded Caroline Astor as arbiters of American society. This powerful alliance included Mamie Fish, known for her unconventional wit, and Alva Vanderbilt Belmont, famous for architectural extravagance and fierce determination. But Tessie carved out her own role. While Alva threw lavish costume balls and Mamie hosted raucous dinners featuring trained seals and baby elephants, Tessie became what her niece Blanche called the drill sergeant of high society. She was strongly addicted to society as business, treating social prominence with the same ruthless focus her father had applied to extracting silver from stubborn Nevada ore. The triumvirate controlled access to America's elite with invitation lists that could make or break fortunes, determining who would be welcomed into Newport's marble halls and who would be forever banished. Tessie's approach was methodical and merciless. She kept detailed records on every potential guest, categorizing them as suitable or unsuitable with the same precision she applied to rating servants. Her daily routine reflected this obsession with control. Every morning, at precisely 9 o'clock, she conducted military-style inspections of Rosecliff, examining every surface for dust or disorder. The servants dreaded these inspections, knowing that Tessie would personally scrub marble floors if they didn't meet her impossible standards, an obsession that eventually cost her sight in one eye when a carpet tack flew up during one of her cleaning frenzies. She classified her staff in written records as good, bad, or rotten, maintaining files that would make a corporate human resources department envious. This level of micromanagement extended to her own body, which she subjected to torturous regimens of starvation and exercise until she fainted, spending thousands on the latest fitness equipment. Most disturbing was her corset ritual. She required her strongest servants to lace her so tightly that she gripped chairs to endure the process. A shocking breach of etiquette she dismissed with aristocratic indifference. Yet despite these controlling tendencies, or perhaps because of them, Tessie succeeded in her ultimate goal, forcing Newport society to orbit around her like planets around a particularly demanding sun. By 1900, no social season was complete without multiple appearances at Rosecliff, where Tessie held court in rooms that proclaimed her transformation from mining heiress to social monarch. But her greatest triumph would require her to literally paint Newport white. Tessie Fair Ulrichs reached the pinnacle of her social reign with the Bal Blanc of August 1904, an all-white extravaganza that would become the most legendary party of the Gilded Age. The event, timed to coincide with the prestigious Astor Cup race, required months of planning and expenditure that would have funded a small city's annual budget. Every surface at Rosecliff disappeared under banks of white flowers, hydrangeas, roses, orchids and lilies of the valley, creating an ethereal wonderland that transformed the mansion into a dream made manifest. She imported white swans to glide across the estate's fountain and commissioned the construction of 12 full-sized white ships with illuminated hulls, anchored offshore to create the illusion of a ghostly fleet. All guests received strict instructions to dress entirely in white, including powdering their hair, with women wearing white silk gowns embroidered with silver thread and diamonds that caught the light like captured stars. The effect was otherworldly. Contemporary accounts described white-clad figures moving through flower-filled rooms like spirits in an enchanted palace, while the ocean beyond glowed with the phantom ships. Newport had seen elaborate parties before, but nothing approaching this level of theatrical perfection, this absolute commitment to transforming reality into fantasy through sheer force of will and unlimited funds. The Bal Blanc represented not just a party, but a declaration of supremacy. Tessie's announcement that she had conquered the social territory her father had only dreamed of entering. But this legendary event was merely one highlight in Tessie's relentless campaign of entertainment designed to cement her position as Newport's premier hostess. She hosted elaborate fairy tale-themed dinners where guests arrived dressed as characters from children's stories, transforming Rosecliff into an adult playground of make-believe. Her coup de théâtre came when she engaged Harry Houdini himself to perform at one of her gatherings, bringing the world's most famous escape artist to entertain her exclusive circle. The ballroom that had hosted white-powdered aristocrats also witnessed ballet performances, opera presentations, and circus acts, each event calculated to outshine whatever her rivals might attempt. When not in use for grand entertainments, she allowed the ballroom to serve as a roller skating rink, a detail that perfectly captured her mix of aristocratic pretension and American practicality. Yet beneath this glittering surface, cracks were appearing in Tessie's carefully constructed facade, manifested in increasingly obsessive behaviours that worried even her indulgent social circle. Her body image fixations had progressed from concerning to dangerous. She would starve herself for days, exercise until she collapsed, and demand her corsets be tightened until she could barely breathe. The cleaning obsessions grew more pronounced, with Tessie sometimes spending entire nights scrubbing floors that servants had already cleaned, convinced they harboured invisible contamination. She began exhibiting paranoid behaviours about money, distrusting even long-time servants, and keeping elaborate records of every penny spent, despite possessing wealth that made such accounting absurd. These compulsions existed alongside her public persona of the gracious hostess, creating a jarring disconnect between the woman who orchestrated magical entertainments and the one who scrubbed floors at midnight. Her marriage to Herman had devolved into open warfare, with the couple arguing viciously in front of guests and living essentially separate lives connected only by legal documents. When the 1906 San Francisco earthquake struck, Tessie saw a potential opportunity for reconciliation, planning an elaborate dinner to celebrate Herman's survival. But Herman never appeared for the reconciliation dinner, delivering a final rebuke that made clear their marriage existed only on paper, a business arrangement gone sour. The contrast between Tessie's public triumphs and private torments grew starker with each passing season, the gulf between appearance and reality widening like cracks in Rosecliff's marble facades. Cracks that would split wide open when Herman died at sea, leaving behind a will that would shake Newport society to its foundations. Hermann Ulrichs died on September 1st, 1906, aboard the SS Kaiser Wilhelm der Grosse, while crossing the Atlantic, delivering one final insult from beyond the grave through his carefully crafted will. In a gesture of posthumous spite, he left his entire estate to his brother Charles, assuming Tessie's inherited millions were sufficient for her needs, an assumption she furiously contested. The ensuing legal battle exposed the couple's marital dysfunction to public scrutiny, revealing years of estrangement and mutual contempt that society columns had carefully ignored. Tessie eventually settled for half of Herman's estate, but the victory felt hollow, secured through lawyers rather than the love she'd never quite managed to purchase. Adding to the period's darkness, Stanford White, the architect who'd built her dream palace, was murdered at Madison Square Garden on June 25, 1906, by millionaire Harry Thor. The killing stemmed from White's sexual assault of Thor's wife, Evelyn Nesbit, when she was just 16, a crime that cast shadows over every building White had designed. For Tessie, the murder forever tainted Rosecliff, linking her monument to social supremacy with one of the era's most sordid scandals. The introduction of federal income tax in 1913 marked the beginning of the end for the lifestyle Tessie had perfected, making such extravagant entertainments financially impossible even for the wealthy. World War I accelerated this decline, rendering ostentatious displays of wealth not just expensive, but unpatriotic, effectively ending the Gilded Age's culture of competitive excess. Tessie, now in her 50s, found herself ruling over an empty kingdom, her skills in social warfare suddenly as obsolete as her father's mining techniques. The rigid hierarchies she'd spent decades mastering crumbled with surprising speed, replaced by a more democratic culture that had no use for her elaborate protocols. As the 1920s progressed, Tessie's mental health deteriorated dramatically, manifesting in behaviours that transformed Rosecliff from palace to asylum. Servants reported finding her in the ballroom at 3 a.m, conducting animated conversations with invisible guests, and setting places for people who existed only in her fracturing mind. She would host elaborate dinner parties for these imaginary companions, moving through the courses and directing phantom servants to attend to guests only she could see. Her niece later wrote that Tessie spent her final years inviting them to stay just a little longer, to take one more glass of champagne, unable to accept that the party had ended. The woman who'd orchestrated the bal blanc now wandered through flowerless rooms, her white hair unpowdered, speaking to ghosts of the society she'd conquered and lost. On November 22, 1926, Theresa Fair Ulrichs died at Rosecliff at age 55, her funeral held in the ballroom where she'd once commanded Newport's elite. She was buried at Woodlawn Cemetery beside the husband she'd battled in life, their eternal proximity a final irony in a relationship defined by distance. Her son Herman Jr. inherited Rosecliff but couldn't maintain it, selling the mansion in 1941 for $21,000, less than 1% of what his mother had spent building it. The mansion suffered years of neglect, with burst pipes creating frozen waterfalls on the grand staircase where Tessie had once made her dramatic entrances. In 1971, the restored mansion was donated to the Preservation Society of Newport County, ensuring its survival as a museum to Gilded Age excess. Today, Rosecliff hosts weddings and galas, its ballroom still echoing with music, though the guests no longer powder their hair white or arrive in footman-attended carriages. The mining camp girl who'd conquered Newport society left behind a ghost story made of marble and gilt, a cautionary tale about the price of social supremacy wrapped in the most beautiful architectural package money could buy, a fitting monument to a woman who'd gained everything she'd wanted and discovered it wasn't nearly enough. Every man in the room falls silent when you enter, not out of respect for your gender, but out of terror for your bank balance. You're the only woman in America who can destroy entire railroad empires with a single investment decision, yet you're also the only woman in America who heats her room with a single candle to save on coal costs. The contradiction should be impossible, unlimited financial power paired with pathological cheapness, but somehow you've made it the foundation of the greatest fortune in history. This was the daily reality of Hetty Green, a woman whose mere presence could trigger market fluctuations and whose financial decisions were studied more carefully than presidential speeches. She accumulated wealth faster than the Gilded Age's most celebrated tycoons, while simultaneously living like poverty had chosen her as its personal mascot. Thus, in today's episode of Old Money Allure, we dive into the extraordinary life of the woman who proved that in America, financial genius trumps social conventions, and that sometimes the most powerful person in the room is the one everyone underestimates. Henrietta Howland Robinson entered the world on November 21, 1834, in New Bedford, Massachusetts, born into wailing wealth and Quaker austerity that would forge the most unlikely financial genius of the Gilded Age. Her father, Edward Mott Robinson, had married strategically into the Howland whaling dynasty, but received a daughter when he desperately wanted a son, refusing to see his wife or newborn child in his disappointment. When Hetty's younger brother died in infancy, leaving Edward without his coveted male heir, her mother Abby sank into a depression from which she never recovered, effectively abandoning 2-year-old Hetty. The rejected toddler was sent to live with her grandfather Gideon Howland and Aunt Sylvia Ann Howland, an abandonment that would prove the making of America's future richest woman. Gideon's failing eyesight transformed little Hetty into his personal reader, but instead of fairy tales, the 6-year-old read him daily financial reports, stock market listings, and shipping news. By age 8, she had opened her first bank account with hoarded nickels. By 13, she served as her father's bookkeeper, managing the accounts of one of New England's most successful maritime enterprises. This unconventional education stood in stark contrast to the needlework and social graces expected of wealthy young women. While her contemporaries learned to curtsy, Hetty mastered compound interest. She attended Quaker boarding schools like Friends Academy and Anna Cabot Lowell's finishing school in Boston, but spent her spare time accompanying her father to counting houses, warehouses, and stockbrokers rather than attending social teas. The Howland Robinson whaling empire commanded more ships than any other New Bedford concern, and young Hetty absorbed every detail of maritime commerce, from insurance rates to seasonal whale oil price fluctuations. Her father's business associates found it unsettling to negotiate with a teenage girl who could quote freight rates from memory and spot calculation errors in complex contracts faster than their own clerks. When 20-year-old Hetty was sent to New York with $1,200 to purchase a trousseau and attract a suitable husband, she spent only $200 on clothes and invested the rest in government bonds. She even sold the expensive wardrobe her father had purchased for her, using the proceeds to buy more treasury bonds, a decision that horrified her family but delighted her balance sheet. Her Quaker upbringing disciplined me towards pomp and show, she later explained, adding that wealth accumulated over generations need make no display to ensure recognition of our position. The 1860s brought the defining crisis of Hetty's early life, when her beloved Aunt Sylvia died in 1865, leaving an estate worth $2 million, approximately $41 million today. Hetty was outraged to discover the wills split the fortune between various charities and institutions, with only a portion going to her in trust, a betrayal by the woman who'd raised her. Driven by fury and greed, Hetty produced what she claimed was an earlier will from 1862 that left her the entire estate outright, complete with a clause invalidating any subsequent wills. The executor, Thomas Mandel, immediately accused her of forgery, leading to the famous Robinson versus Mandel case of 1868 that would forever taint her reputation. The trial became a sensation, featuring groundbreaking testimony from mathematician Benjamin Pierce, who analysed Sylvia's signatures using statistical methods never before applied in court. Pierce's mathematical analysis of 42 signature samples revealed that the questioned signature had far too many overlapping downstrokes to be genuine. The document was a forgery. Hetty lost spectacularly, the scandal following her for the rest of her life, branding her publicly as a forger willing to cheat charities to line her own pockets. The humiliation of being exposed as a criminal became one of the defining moments that hardened her against society and deepened her mistrust of everyone around her. But even as the courts condemned her forgery, Hetty was already plotting her next move, a marriage that would give her the social cover to operate freely in the masculine world of high finance, while a far more audacious fraud than forging signatures awaited. She would forge an entirely new identity as Wall Street's most feared financier. In 1867, at age 33, Hetty Robinson married Edward Henry Green, a wealthy Vermont businessman involved in international trade. But their union came with conditions no bride had ever before imposed. She insisted on a prenuptial agreement, keeping their finances completely separate, an arrangement so unprecedented that lawyers had to draft entirely new language to accommodate her demands. Edward Green, 14 years her senior with his own million-dollar fortune from Philippine trading, agreed to these terms, perhaps seeing in Hetty's fierce independence the very qualities that attracted him. The newlyweds relocated to London, partly to escape the glare of Hetty's forgery scandal, where both children were born. Edward, Ned, Howland, Robinson Green in 1868, and Sylvia Ann Howland Green in 1871. In Britain's financial centre, Hetty executed one of history's greatest contrarian trades, recognising opportunity where others saw only disaster in America's post-Civil War financial chaos. US government bonds were trading at deep discounts, 50 to 60 cents on the dollar, as investors feared the Treasury would redeem them in depreciated paper, greenbacks, rather than gold. Swimming against prevailing sentiment, Hetty correctly predicted that America would honour its debts in gold to maintain international creditworthiness, pouring millions into these battered bonds. She reportedly earned up to $200,000 in a single day during this period, demonstrating an almost supernatural ability to time market movements that left London bankers stunned. British financiers, accustomed to dealing with American speculators seeking quick profits, found Hetty's patient accumulation strategy baffling. She would hold positions for years, content with steady appreciation rather than gambling on market swings. When President Ulysses Grant vindicated her bet in 1869 by signing the Public Credit Act guaranteeing gold redemption, Hetty netted $1.25 million in profit. She had discovered her life's philosophy. I buy when things are low and nobody wants them. I keep them until they go up and people are crazy to get them. The 1870s saw the Greens return to America, where Hetty began building her reputation as Wall Street's most unlikely power player, a woman operating alone in a world of men. She eschewed partnerships and expensive offices, working instead from a desk provided free by Chemical National Bank, which was happy to accommodate someone with her massive deposits. Her investment strategy was elegantly simple: maintain huge cash reserves, wait for panics, then swoop in to buy distressed assets, or lend at profitable but fair interest rates. During the Panic of 1873, while overextended speculators went bankrupt, Hetty deployed her cash to purchase undervalued railroad stocks and foreclose on prime real estate. Her real estate empire grew to include properties in Chicago, St. Louis, and New York, with Hetty personally travelling to inspect foreclosed properties, often riding in day coaches to save on Pullman fares. She became what one observer called particularly adept at prospering during the downfall of others, buying when blood ran in the streets and selling when euphoria returned. But Hetty's marriage was crumbling under the weight of her success and Edward's failures, particularly after the 1884 panic that would expose their fundamental incompatibility. Edward had disastrously speculated in Louisville and Nashville railroad stock using heavy margin debt, and when the panic struck, he faced ruin with over $500,000 in losses. The twist was that he'd secretly used some of Hetty's securities as collateral, leading banks to attempt freezing her funds to cover his massive debts. Hetty's fury was volcanic. She sued to protect her assets, publicly humiliating her husband rather than bail him out, effectively ending their marriage, though they never formally divorced. Edward retreated to live on a small allowance from his wife, broken in health and spirit, while Hetty continued building her empire with single-minded focus. By 1890, she had become known as the Queen of Wall Street, commanding respect from the same men who mocked her appearance and eccentricities. But her greatest test would come during the Panic of 1907, when even J.P. Morgan would need her help to save the American financial system from complete collapse. The woman controlling millions of dollars in assets wore the same threadbare black dress for years, mended and remended till it practically fell apart, creating the most jarring contrast in Gilded Age America. While Vanderbilts built marble palaces and Astors draped themselves in diamonds, Hetty Green lived in $20 a month boarding houses, heated only by a small stove to save on coal. She carried her lunch in a metal box, oatmeal or graham crackers, eating at her borrowed desk to avoid restaurant expenses, a sight that made Wall Street clerks snicker behind their hands. Her office routine never varied: arrive early at Chemical National Bank, spread out her papers, and spend hours analysing investments while other patrons conducted business around her. She kept her wealth in negotiable securities, sewn into specially made pockets in her petticoats, walking the streets of New York with millions literally attached to her person. The newspapers christened her the Witch of Wall Street, a moniker that stuck like tar, reinforced by her austere appearance and the perpetual mourning attire she adopted after Edward's death in 1902. But the most shocking story involved her son Ned's leg, a tale that would haunt Hetty's reputation more than any financial manipulation or business ruthlessness ever could. When teenage Ned injured his leg in a sledding accident, Hetty reportedly dressed him in rags and took him to charity clinics, pretending to be poor to avoid medical fees. The leg worsened over time, gangrene set in, and eventually required amputation, all supposedly because the richest woman in America wouldn't pay for proper treatment. The truth was more complex. Hetty had sought multiple medical opinions and tried various treatments, but 19th century medicine offered limited options for severe bone infections. Contemporary accounts suggest she spent considerable sums consulting specialists in New York and even considered taking Ned to Europe for experimental treatments before the amputation became inevitable. Yet the image of a mother too cheap to save her son's leg proved irresistible to newspapers eager to paint her as a monster in petticoats. Hetty's own health suffered from her extreme frugality. She endured an untreated hernia for 20 years, binding it with a stick rather than pay for surgery. When a physician finally examined her in 1915 and recommended an immediate operation costing $150, she stormed out shouting, "You're all alike, a bunch of robbers!" Her paranoia extended beyond money to personal safety. She obtained a gun permit in 1902, telling authorities she needed protection, mostly against lawyers. She claimed to receive numerous death threats and kidnapping plots, moving constantly between cheap lodgings to avoid establishing patterns potential attackers could exploit. Her financial operations during the Panic of 1907 demonstrated her true power, when she stepped forward as the economy teetered on collapse. With banks failing and even JP Morgan's consortium running short of funds, Hetty Green possessed the liquid capital to stabilise the system. She lent freely at reasonable rates, later boasting that she was the only person in New York with cash during the crisis, effectively functioning as a one-woman Federal Reserve. By 1909, she declared in a rare interview, "I have mortgages on 28 churches and on 4 cemeteries. I have blocks of business houses, theatres, libraries, stables, hotels, restaurants, farms in nearly everything you could imagine." Her feuds with male financiers became legendary, particularly her ongoing battle with railroad magnate Collis P. Huntington over Texas railroad interests. When Huntington threatened her son Ned over railroad disputes, Hetty pointed to a pistol on her desk and declared, "Up to now, Huntington, you have dealt with Hetty Green, the businesswoman. Now you are fighting Hetty Green, the mother. Harm one hair of Ned's head and I'll put a bullet through your heart." The confrontation at Chemical Bank became Wall Street legend, cementing her reputation as someone who would use any weapon, financial or otherwise, to protect her interests. Yet beneath the witch's exterior lay a brilliant mind practicing investment strategies decades ahead of her time, strategies that would make her the richest woman in the world while living like a pauper. Hetty Green died on July 3, 1916, at age 81, supposedly after a stroke, triggered by arguing with a maid over the price of skim milk. A fittingly frugal end to an extraordinary life. Her estate, valued between $100 and $200 million, made her the richest woman in the world, having transformed an initial inheritance of $7 million into a fortune rivaling Rockefeller's. The will divided everything equally between her 2 children, Ned and Sylvia, finally releasing the wealth Hetty had guarded more carefully than dragons guard gold. Her final years had seen her grow even more eccentric, hobbling into her office on crutches due to her untreated ailments, still scrutinising financial statements by the light of a single dim bulb to save electricity. One of her last major financial moves involved shifting much of her wealth into municipal bonds and other tax-exempt securities, proving that even approaching death, she thought like a clever accountant determined to minimise estate taxes. The newspapers reported that her estate paid $1.1 million in taxes, one of the largest individual tax payments ever recorded at that time. A final irony for someone who'd spent decades dodging tax collectors. Ned Green, freed from his mother's iron control, immediately embarked on a spending spree that would have sent Hetty spinning in her grave. He married Mabel Harlow, his longtime mistress and former prostitute whom Hetty had despised, and moved to Texas to live like the playboy his mother never let him become. The one-legged colonel built opulent mansions, collected diamonds and pornography with equal enthusiasm, commissioned the world's largest yacht, only to discover chronic seasickness, and installed one of America's first private radio stations. His Round Hill estate in Massachusetts became legendary for its successes, featuring the era's most powerful private radio transmitter and parties that attracted showgirls, politicians, and anyone else drawn to unlimited champagne and no questions asked. He threw parties that became legendary for their excess, surrounding himself with showgirls and wards, revelling in spending what his mother had hoarded with such grim determination. By his death in 1936, Ned had burned through millions, yet somehow still left $44 million, proving the staggering magnitude of Hetty's accumulated wealth. His sister Sylvia, who inherited both her share and what remained of Ned's estate, lived quietly and unmarried, seemingly content to be the anti-Hetty in every way. When Sylvia died in 1951, she shocked everyone by leaving her entire fortune, $200 million, to 64 different charities, hospitals, libraries, and educational institutions. It was as if the wealth Hetty had clutched so tightly finally found the social purpose it had always been denied, a generation too late for Hetty to receive any credit. The Witch of Wall Street's riches were at last doing benevolent work, funding medical research and education instead of gathering interest in dusty vaults. Modern financial historians recognize Hetty as America's first value investor, practicing principles that Benjamin Graham would codify and Warren Buffett would popularize decades later. Her contrarian approach, buying when others panicked, maintaining liquidity, avoiding leverage, proved far more successful than the speculation-mad strategies of her male contemporaries. She had matched wits with Morgan, Huntington and Rockefeller, accumulating wealth that rivaled theirs while spending less in a year than they spent on a single party. Yet because she founded no universities, endowed no libraries, and created no foundation, her name faded while theirs adorned institutions across America. The final irony was complete. The woman who trusted no one with her money had no choice but to trust her children, who disposed of it in ways she never could have imagined. Recent biographers have attempted to rehabilitate her image, arguing that a male financier with identical methods would be celebrated rather than vilified for the same behaviours. They point out that her treatment of her son's injury, while harsh, wasn't unusual for the era's limited medical knowledge, and that her frugality stemmed from Quaker principles rather than mere greed. But perhaps Hetty Green's true legacy lies not in the fortune she accumulated, but in proving that a woman could dominate Wall Street using nothing but her wits, her will, and an absolute refusal to spend money on anything but making more money. A feat so extraordinary that society could only explain it by calling her a witch. Behind every great fortune lies a scandal, but Arabella Huntington's story contains enough controversial relationships to fuel an entire season of period drama television. This was a woman who understood that in Gilded Age America, strategic patience could transform any disadvantage into ultimate victory over the very people who tried to exclude you. Her ability to navigate complex romantic arrangements while building independent wealth demonstrates a level of long-term thinking that puts modern business strategists to shame. She proved that being permanently blacklisted from society's most exclusive circles meant nothing if you possessed the vision to create your own institutions that would educate and inspire future generations. Her transformation from social pariah to cultural icon represents one of history's most spectacular examples of turning prejudice into motivation for greatness. On today's episode of Old Money Allure, we investigate how Arabella Huntington used scandal as fuel to build a legacy that made her enemies irrelevant and her name immortal. Meet Arabella Duval Yarrington, a woman so determined to escape poverty that she would lie about everything from her birthday to her birthplace while executing one of history's most successful long-term relationship strategies. Born around 1850 in Richmond, Virginia, Arabella grew up in the kind of desperate circumstances that make people either give up entirely or become absolutely ruthless in their pursuit of something better. Her father died when she was 9, leaving her mother Catherine to operate a boarding house in Richmond's roughest neighbourhood, a district filled with hotels, brothels, gambling dens and slave auction houses, where respectability was a luxury the Yarrington family couldn't afford. But this harsh environment would prove to be Arabella's greatest asset, because it was here that she would encounter her destiny in the form of Collis P. Huntington, a railroad magnate 32 years her senior. Arabella was nothing if not a strategic thinker, and by 19 she had devised a plan so audacious it would have impressed the most calculating fortune hunters of her generation. In 1869, she entered into what appeared to be a marriage with John Archer Worsham, a gambling parlour operator who offered her the perfect cover for what she was really planning. The marriage was actually an elaborate deception designed to give Arabella respectability while allowing her to maintain her relationship with Collis Huntington, because Worsham was already married to another woman named Annette back in Richmond. This arrangement allowed Arabella to establish herself in New York society as the respectable Mrs. Worsham, while conducting what was essentially a 14-year audition for the role of Collis Huntington's wife. In 1870, Arabella gave birth to a son named Archer Milton Worsham, whose paternity would become one of the Gilded Age's most carefully guarded secrets. Most historians now believe that Collis Huntington was the biological father, making this child both a love child and a future heir to one of America's greatest fortunes. Conveniently, John Worsham died shortly after Archer's birth, though in reality he simply returned to Richmond and his legal wife, leaving Arabella free to claim widowhood and continue her relationship with Huntington. Arabella spent the next 14 years living as Collis Huntington's mistress, while he remained married to his first wife, Elizabeth, demonstrating a level of patience and strategic thinking that would have impressed military generals. During this period, she wasn't just sitting around waiting. She was actively building her own fortune through shrewd real estate investments that put her in direct competition with titans like William H. Vanderbilt and John D. Rockefeller. In 1877, she purchased property in New York that she later sold to John D. Rockefeller himself, proving that she could play the robber baron game just as effectively as the men who had invented it. She also began developing her passion for art collecting, filling her West 54th Street house with progressive French landscapes and aesthetic movement furnishings that would establish her reputation as a woman of sophisticated taste. But Arabella's most valuable investment was in her relationship with Collis Huntington, and she was about to discover that 14 years of perfect mistresshood would pay dividends beyond her wildest dreams. For 14 years, Arabella lived as Collis Huntington's mistress in what was essentially the world's longest and most expensive job interview for the position of railroad tycoon's wife. The arrangement was an open secret in New York society, yet Arabella found herself consistently excluded from elite circles dominated by families like the Astors and Vanderbilts, who considered her scandalous past utterly unforgivable. Society gatekeeper Ward McAllister was approached with a $9,000 bribe from Collis to provide introductions for Arabella, but when Collis balked at paying the full amount, McAllister leaked damaging gossip that ensured their permanent exile from New York's grandest ballrooms. Despite this social ostracism, Arabella used her time productively, demonstrating remarkable business acumen, while Collis showered her with extravagant gifts, including a rope of 119 blue diamonds from Tiffany's. When Elizabeth Huntington finally died in 1884, Collis wasted no time in making their relationship legal, marrying Arabella in his San Francisco home, with the ceremony performed by the famous Reverend Henry Ward Beecher. Beecher received 4 $1,000 bills as his fee for the ceremony, which was either extremely generous or the going rate for legitimizing 14 years of adultery in Gilded Age America. Collis formally adopted 14-year-old Archer at the time of the marriage, a move that was widely interpreted as his tacit admission of paternity and his desire to secure the boy's inheritance rights. Even marriage couldn't overcome the stigma of Arabella's past, and despite their immense wealth and Fifth Avenue address, the couple remained permanently excluded from the inner circles of New York high society. But Arabella was building something far more valuable than social acceptance. She was positioning herself to inherit one of America's greatest fortunes, while simultaneously developing the expertise that would make her one of the most influential art collectors of her generation. She spent lavishly during her marriage to Collis, including $300,000 on pearls in 1906, more than anyone else in the Western world had ever spent on jewellery at one time. Her personal expenses were equally extravagant, with over $4,000 spent on lingerie from a single Paris shop in 1912, because apparently even underwear needed to reflect her extraordinary lifestyle. When scandal sheet publisher William D'Alton Mann tried to print details of her past in 1905, Arabella paid him $15,000 to stay silent, then fled to Europe minutes ahead of a subpoena when Mann was sued for libel. When Collis P. Huntington died on August 13, 1900, at his Adirondack camp, Arabella's 14-year investment in being the perfect mistress and 20-year investment in being the perfect wife finally paid off spectacularly. She inherited more than $50 million, equivalent to approximately $1.9 billion in today's currency, making her not just one of the wealthiest women in America, but a legitimate billionaire by modern standards. The inheritance represented 2/3 of Huntington's vast railroad and industrial fortune, with the remaining third going to his nephew, Henry E. Huntington, setting up the next chapter of Arabella's extraordinary life. Nonetheless, Arabella wasn't content to simply enjoy her newfound wealth in quiet widowhood. She was about to shock even scandal-hardened Gilded Age society by marrying the one man guaranteed to cause maximum family drama. The most outrageous romance of Arabella's scandalous life began when she set her sights on the one man who could help her consolidate the entire Huntington fortune, her late husband's own nephew. With her inheritance making her worth approximately $1.9 billion in today's currency, Arabella had achieved the kind of wealth that could buy anything except the one thing she'd always been denied: complete social acceptance. But rather than spending her golden years quietly enjoying her fortune, the 60-something billionaire was about to embark on the most controversial relationship of her already scandalous life. Henry E. Huntington, Collis's nephew and business heir who had inherited the remaining third of the Huntington fortune, had admired Arabella for years and saw her widowhood as his opportunity to strike. After Collis's death, Henry separated from his wife and moved to the Metropolitan Club, just 3 blocks from Arabella's Fifth Avenue mansion, positioning himself for what would become one of the most strategic courtships in Gilded Age history. Henry's approach to winning Arabella was unique for the era. He pursued her through art purchases that demonstrated both his wealth and his understanding of her sophisticated tastes. His first major acquisition was a statement to this strategy. He spent $577,000 on French curtains called the Noble Pastoral at Arabella's urging, even before they were married. This amount exceeded the entire construction cost of his future San Marino mansion, proving that love, or at least the pursuit of consolidating 2 massive fortunes, makes people do financially irrational things. After a 7-year courtship that involved countless art purchases and strategic romantic gestures, Arabella finally accepted Henry's proposal in 1913. On July 16, 1913, the 63-year-old Arabella married the 63-year-old Henry at the American Church in Paris, creating one of the most scandalous unions in American high society history. The marriage shocked their social circles because it united the remaining Huntington fortune under one roof and represented the ultimate insider transaction between 2 people who already knew exactly what they were getting. More importantly for gossip-hungry society, it meant that Arabella had married her late husband's nephew, creating the kind of family drama that would have made modern tabloid editors weep with joy. Their prenuptial agreement, signed just 4 days before the wedding, protected both of their interests while allowing them to combine their collecting activities and create what would become one of America's greatest art collections. The marriage was both a business merger and a genuine love match, as evidenced by Henry's declaration in his 60s that, "I am just beginning to live, and life seems so very, very sweet." Together, they assembled one of the finest collections of 18th-century British art outside the United Kingdom, including gems like Gainsborough's The Blue Boy and Lawrence's Pinky. The couple spent $21 million between 1908 and 1917 on art, including works by Rembrandt, Velázquez, and other old masters that would become the foundation of their cultural legacy. But beyond their art collecting, the marriage represented something even more significant: Arabella's final triumph over the social prejudices that had excluded her for decades. By marrying Henry, she not only consolidated 2 fortunes, she had positioned herself to create something that would make every society family who had ever snubbed her completely irrelevant to history. What Arabella accomplished through her marriage to Henry would prove that the woman once excluded from every important ballroom in New York was about to build something more enduring than all their reputations combined. The marriage between Arabella and Henry Huntington became the foundation for creating a cultural legacy that would make their names immortal long after the society families who had scorned them were forgotten. Arabella spent her final years dividing time between New York, Paris, and California. Though she preferred the cultural sophistication of Paris and New York to the West Coast estate that Henry was developing, she limited her stays at the San Marino ranch to just 2 months per year, forcing the devoted Henry to follow her across the country and across the Atlantic to maintain their relationship. Her art collecting reached extraordinary heights during this period, including a $2.5 million acquisition from the Rodolphe Kahn collection through dealer Joseph Duveen that represented one of the largest private art purchases in American history. Beyond art, Arabella proved herself to be a forward-thinking philanthropist who supported causes that reflected her personal values and experiences as a woman who had fought her way up from poverty. She supported the women's suffrage movement by providing financial backing rather than marching herself, understanding that her money could be more effective than her personal participation in protests. She donated generously to institutions including Harvard Medical School, Hampton Institute, the American Geographical Society, and the Hispanic Society of America, which was founded by her son, Archer. Her spending habits remained spectacularly extravagant throughout her final years, including $3,112 on skincare in 1921 and $6,349 on wardrobe alterations in 1923. These amounts, equivalent to $57,000 and $116,000 respectively in today's currency, proved that even in her 70s, Arabella understood that maintaining her appearance was essential to maintaining her influence. Henry's vision for their collections was always public-minded, and even before Arabella's death, he had begun planning to transform their San Marino estate into a public institution that would educate and inspire future generations. When Arabella died on September 16, 1924, in New York City at age 72 to 74, she left behind more than just a massive fortune and incredible art collection. She had proven that a woman born into poverty in a Richmond boarding house could not only achieve extraordinary wealth, but could also create institutions that would educate and inspire people for generations. Henry died 3 years later in 1927, and both are buried in a circular white marble temple called the Temple of the Four Seasons, designed by John Russell Pope as a precursor to the Jefferson Memorial. The Huntington Library Art Collections and Botanical Gardens stands today as Arabella's most enduring legacy, housing nearly 9 million manuscripts and books, world-class art collections, and 120 acres of botanical gardens. The institution welcomes over 750,000 visitors annually and supports more than 1,700 researchers, proving that Arabella's vision extended far beyond her own lifetime. Her transformation from a Southern boarding house operator's daughter to one of America's most influential cultural philanthropists represents the ultimate Gilded Age success story and the final victory over every society family that had ever dared to exclude her. Through her strategic relationships, shrewd investments, and cultural vision, Arabella Huntington created a legacy that continues to educate and inspire more than a century after her death, proving that the best revenge against social prejudice is building something so magnificent that history remembers you while forgetting your enemies entirely.